Let's talk about porn. How is porn contributing to this rise of rough sex? And how is the availability and accessibility of porn, in your opinion, or based on science, and I know you've looked at how people learn about sex through porn. How is that affecting young people?
Pornography is so widely available. And just like many parents don't know that rough sex is increasing, many parents, not all, but many parents don't know what today's porn looks like. When they think of porn, they might think of something that they saw in the 80s or 90s or early 2000s.
That's a really good point.
And porn has changed. And even though there is still some really nice high quality stuff out there, I mean, 14-year-olds are not looking for like queer feminist porn. And even if they're finding it, they don't have the credit card to pay for it. Yeah. Right. So there are differences with what is available on the internet.
Freely available,
and really being like pushed on you. Right. And so the sort of free, widespread mainstream stuff is really, really aggressive. And so there's lots of research showing like lots of aggression, especially directed toward women, for like porn that features men and women having sex. Like women, again, are often going to be the targets of like the choking and the hitting and the punching and the spanking and the name calling, like the really, really derogatory names that some of the women in our studies say has been more harmful to them than some of the physical stuff that's happened, because they may be called a name that triggers up memories of being abused, either physically or sexually when they were younger, or that it just suddenly, even if they don't have abuse histories, the name might feel so bad to them that it suddenly it flips a switch and thinks, wait, is this like an okay hookup, or is this person going to hurt me? Because why would like a person who liked me call me this horrible name? So there's all these things that are happening in pornography, and pornography is seen at really young ages. There was a Common Sense Media report that came out in 2023 that showed that on average, kids are seeing porn at around age 12. And I think we really have to think about that phrase, on average.
Because it's even earlier.
If it's on average, that means there's lots of 7, 8, 9, 10, 11-year-olds too. And yes, there's 13 and ups also, but there's a lot of children, elementary age school children, who are seeing pornography. And we also know that teens are waiting on average longer to have partnered sex. So what does that mean if you start seeing porn when you're 8 or 10 or 12, but you don't have partnered sex till you're 16, 17, 18, 19, 20? Well, it may mean that you are watching pornography and kind of soaking in these like lessons and scripts about how to have sex for 5 to 10 years before you ever kiss somebody. So what we hear from a lot of young people is that those early experiences when they do have partnered sex are often really rough. They are sometimes scary. They are sometimes very much what many of us would consider to be assault. You know, it can take time to realize like what you want. It can take a lot of experience and education and confidence to feel like you can assert, I don't want this anymore, or I don't like this, or here's how I would rather be making out or having sex. So even though some young people are standing up for themselves and saying, I don't like this, it can take time. So they may have experiences that really don't feel well for 3 months, 6 months, a year, 2 years, 5 years, before they really develop in a way that they can create a better sex lives for themselves. So I really, and I want to say, like, we don't know much about that path yet. We are starting to see some studies. There was a study out of Sweden a couple years ago where they interviewed 16 and 17-year-old girls about pornography. Mm-hmm. It wasn't about rough sex. It was about pornography. And the authors came at it from the perspective of, hey, this is like Sweden's a feminist country. What does it mean to be a young woman in a feminist, like very feminist identified country, and yet to be like watching porn? And so it was really focused on that. It was really interesting. But you could see some evidence in these young women's interviews where they would say, yeah, I mean, my boyfriend and I, when we got together, we were doing all of these things. And in one young woman's own words, she said, that we're not normal, like choking. And then they kind of looked at each other at some point and said, we don't want to do this anymore. Like, this doesn't feel good to us. So I think we've got to keep in mind that pornography is very widely and freely available. It is often seen by young children. It's often seen by accident. by young children. They're not always looking for it.
Yeah.
When they are looking for it, they're sometimes finding it because they just wanted to learn about sex. Like maybe somebody told them like really good information about like how babies are made, but they were like, I just can't figure it out. Right. So
Yeah.
they wanted to see like, how does that happen? Or they wanted to see breasts or vulvas or penises. But for lots of reasons, kids are getting access to adult materials, and not just adult materials, but ones that are really aggressive. And we need to think about that. I think, one of the things I advise, and yes, your kid for parents, is even for like elementary school age kids, if you're dropping your kid off for a play date or a sleepover, talk with the other parents about what device access is going to look like during that play date or sleepover. If you're getting kids dropped off at your house, make sure that they're not on devices. You don't need them to be like accidentally stumbling
Coming
upon
across.
porn and getting a phone call later from the other parent saying, why did my kid see pornography at your house? So we have to like have these conversations with kids, and often at younger ages than many of us who are parents thought we would be having those
Absolutely.
conversations. But it's better for it to come from us, for us to prepare them. And so that they can know like, oh, if I see this, I can walk away. I can talk to you because even though you didn't want me to see this, I'm not going to get in trouble. I can come to you with questions. Like we want that for our kids, that they can come to us and we can help them sort it out and answer questions about what they might have seen and how they feel about it. But we can't pretend it's not out there and that it's not happening.
And I talk about this often. I say, even if you can put all the restrictions on the devices and control what they see in your home or on the device you gave them, you cannot control their friend at school who may have a phone that's not restricted and gets to show them something, or they accidentally see something. I remember someone I spoke to who said their first exposure was like a blurred image. It wasn't even like a true pornography image, but that was enough to make them become very, very curious and sort of try to go find this information. And kids know more about devices and hacking into different places than we do, right? And so I think digging your head in the sand and saying, oh, my kid's not going to see it yet is foolish. And we have to sort of have the discussion. And I've been very open about how I do talk to my children, at least my older son so far, about sex and about his potential to see pornography and what that might mean to him and what questions may arise, because I think it's really important. And their brains are not fully developed even until they're 25.
That's right.
So, they still are immature in the brain sense, even in college. And so I think we have to keep touching base with them. And the bigger concern is like they're not having the discussion about what's okay and what's not, and then not feeling comfortable because their brains aren't fully formed and they're not confident yet. And they don't have all the tools that we have as adults to sort of say, wait, I don't like this. Like in Sweden, that study you told us about, like they had the sense because they were probably raised in a very feminist and very sort of community that talks about this openly for many years, whereas we sort of don't talk about sex. We don't talk about it in school in any sort of meaningful way about these sorts of things, right? We talk about basic consent. We talk about putting a condom on and STIs and pregnancy. And that's probably the best sex ed you're going to get. And sometimes it's much worse than that and maybe not accurate. So I think it's just so important as parents that we have to take on this role.
It is. And it's, for many people, I get it. They may be thinking, why would we ever talk to kids about pornography? Well, you just kind of have to these days because it is the world we're living in. It does not feel good to most parents. I mean, even like those of us who are
it doesn't feel good to me.
Researchers and educators and physicians and stuff. I mean, I talk with my colleagues and we're like, oh my gosh, why is this the world we're living in? But it is. And so you say, okay, like this is the world we're in, and I want to keep my kids safe. I want them to have an open, trusting relationship with me. I want them to come to me when they see things or hear things that don't sit well with them. And so, yeah, we're going to have these conversations. And, even if the other kids aren't showing devices. I mean, I have heard so many stories from people who work with kids, either in school systems or as therapists, who get these referrals and they say, oh, there's like a third or a fourth or a fifth grade classroom where, kids kind of like maybe in the school bathroom or other private places away from the adults have started like enacting things that they've seen in pornography. And then it can take a while before the teacher or some other, principal or somebody at the school hears about it. And then they may have had 5 or 6 or 8 or half the class of the kids who have gone in there and like literally been like trying these things that they've seen in pornography, not quite doing them exactly the same way because they can't figure it all out and their bodies don't always, work in the same ways. But it has horrified some of these schools and parents. understandably. And what has ultimately come up is that, oh yeah, well, there was, one or two kids who had seen pornography at home on devices, either provided by the school or provided by the family. And the kid had some privacy. And they watched these things. They learned maybe about like anal sex or vaginal sex or oral sex. And then they started trying to like act these things out because they were curious. And I mean, on school grounds.
I can only imagine the backlash where the parents would just blame the school and the school would be so embarrassed that they would never talk about it, like never they don't want it to get public. And so there would be no meaningful change from that incident except for just like shame and hide.
In the experiences I know of, I mean, I will say that like they got adult experts, like, psychologists and stuff to come in, but they had to like talk with the whole class, right? In some of these cases, because sometimes so many kids were involved and even if they hadn't done it, they might have heard about stuff from peers. So they would have like whole class conversations, kids who were identified with like more, either like kind of starting all of this or maybe being even coercive in some of the things that they were doing, got like more one-on-one help and stuff. But the thing is, you're right. I mean, people still keep these things private enough that I wouldn't have heard about these if it wasn't my field.
Exactly.
And I didn't hear about it. It wasn't like I heard about it in the community. It's like I hear about it because it's my profession and I have colleagues who share about it. But we're not having the broader conversations we need to have because people do feel some shame. Like, oh, did I do something wrong by giving my kid, a device or letting them use it while I had to like go to work, especially during the pandemic, right? That happened to a lot of families. How do I go to work so we can pay our mortgage or our rent and like buy food and also like help my kid with their education and stuff? I mean, that was a real thing for many families. And schools now very commonly give devices. In Australia, there's been a big push, which has been so important. They have essentially said, hey, if schools are going to be giving out devices, or even if they're not giving out devices, if they're requiring kids to go on the internet to do school assignments, then we also think they need to be talking with kids about digital safety, digital health, digital citizenship, even about like pornography issues in age appropriate ways so that we don't have the problems that we're having. And they were having problems. So more places in Australia are doing that. And I think that's something that more communities all around the world need to think about. If it is the norm to have kids on the internet and devices, then we need to think, first of all, what is the safety of those spaces? And also, how do we support our kids in having safer experiences online?
My mind is a little bit blown today. You did do a study in 2021 where you looked at how children and teenagers used porn for education. And I wanted to share the stats. So in terms of learning about sex when it was adolescent age, it was about 8.4%, which is still a high number, but it went up to almost a fourth, 24.5% in the 18 to 24-year-old group. 1 in 4 young adults who don't have fully formed brains are learning sex from porn alone. Like, that is insane.
Or primarily from porn.
Primarily.
But yeah, like that's a big influence. And it is astounding because we always say too in sex education, like who is the best person to teach you like how to have sex with them? It's that person. It's not pornography because everyone varies. And what one person likes in terms of how they are kissed or how they're touched or how they're licked or how you have intercourse or whatever, it will vary from person to person. And so many young people, I think, feel like they have to be a great partner, right? They have to be impressive. And there's a lot of pressure on young men to be like really good at sex and to somehow have this knowledge just like naturally imparted.
Like right away.
And it's not how it works, right? And so we really need to make more space for development, for trial and error, but for people to figure those things out with the support of books, of like really good sex education, because porn is something that many young people will go to or rely on, or somebody sends them a link and they check it out. I mean, I remember one of the most heartbreaking ones, and I think I wrote about this in Yes, Your Kid because it was so impactful to me, was a young woman who shared in an interview that we did. It was about choking and rough sex, but pornography came up, and it turned out she had started to look at it like in elementary school. And it would be because there was a boy that was like, her boyfriend. They weren't sexually active at the time, but he had shared with her that he felt addicted to porn. And
in elementary school,
he felt like he was addicted to porn. And she was so curious, in her words, kind of like what these pornography actresses had that she didn't.
In elementary school,
that she went online. to learn this. And that was her introduction to porn. And it just blew my mind, like that she was a kid, you know, I think like 5th or 6th grade or something. And she was a kid and thinking, what does this adult pornography actress have, you know, that I don't? And she was comparing herself to those women who are actresses, and who are adults and who are in, you know, sexually explicit, you know, pornographic films. And just, I mean, it broke my heart. And, you know, and she was like a really smart kid from actually a very like wealthy, like highly educated, like somewhat conservative community that I'm familiar with. So, I mean, I knew where she was from. And I thought, you know, there are a lot of people who would say, oh no, like, you know,
not my daughter,
not my kid. And that's actually why like the book is Yes, Your Kid, because so many people think that whether it's choking or rough sex or pornography or sharing images, many of us aren't familiar with the world as it is today because it's not the world as it was when we grew up.
Yeah.
And it is so easy to think, oh, it's just kids who are vulnerable to exploitation or abuse. And we have to say, you know, this is the world and we need to be a part of these conversations so we can support our kids.
Yeah. It is so important. And I think, again, digging your head in the sand and acting like it's not there is not going to fix the problem. I always share this because I think it's really impactful for people who grew up our generation or older. When we grew up, watching porn was challenging. Like you had to find a tape, find a VCR, find a room where no one was, and actually be able to watch that, right? That was one. Two was you'd have to find a magazine, hide it somewhere where nobody would find it, be able to, again, find a quiet room where no one was going to walk in on you and look at it. Whatever it is, it was extremely challenging to obtain, whereas now it is so easy to find freely accessible porn that is also very alarming. And you talk about this in your book, but it will talk about like incest and we'll talk about with siblings or mother-in-laws or whatever, like just very things that are not normal and not appropriate, right? Like incest is not appropriate and there's a reason that it's not appropriate, but like it's wild to me, right? And I get that some people like they see the forbidden thing. I think when you're an adult, you can see that this is just for entertainment. It is not real life and you can differentiate that. But when you are not fully formed in your brain, you can't. You don't know. It's wild.
Yeah. And, you know, I have not seen a lot of this here in the US yet. There's also not really good research on it, so I don't know. But I do have colleagues in, you know, Australia, New Zealand who have shared that in terms of the incest issue, that they have seen increases. And, you know, they're hearing this from counselors who work with kids and teens, that they've heard it from like youth workers, from law enforcement, who have seen increases in the number of young people that are having kind of, you know, incest experiences and non-consensual ones. And that, you know, having watched incest porn seems to be connected to those. And so they are doing, you know, some of my colleagues are doing a really good job of trying to like educate parents and communities and schools around these issues around like pornography, because it's a popular genre for some people. And so what messages that sends kids that that's who you're supposed to, you know, explore with sexually, like it's not healthy. It's not okay. It's really harmful to a lot of young people. And so we have heard, I mean, I've heard a little bit about this in the US, but I don't think we've had enough attention on it here. So I don't know how much it's happening here, but I think it's so important to be mindful of, because yes, the genres are things like that. There's other genres that are like, some people can't believe these things are real, but they are, you know, like gagging somebody with a penis to the point where like you vomit. And I had a very small role in working on the documentary Hot Girls Wanted, like, you know, nearly a decade ago. And that was one of the genres, you know, that came up. And I think one of the things, again, being like in the sexuality field for so long, like I have met people who were involved either as like on-set photographers or as actresses in pornography in the 80s and 90s. And when you hear those people's stories, they say like, we weren't doing any of these things back then, right? Those of us who, you know, anybody who did like happen to see a magazine or a video in the 80s or 90s and stuff, like that stuff wasn't even being shown. And many of those actors will say, yeah, we were never asked to do those things. Or even if you did, like you might have been paid such an extraordinary amount of money because it was so rare and so stigmatized and not, you know, and some of these things just didn't happen. So whereas now there's such a competition and like the online space for porn.
Yeah.
And that like a lot of people who work in that industry now say, oh yeah, we've had to like be sort of harder and rougher and more shocking to get the views. And so the stuff that's out there is trickier than it was 20 or 30 years ago.
It's wild.